Hello and welcome to Querying the Ballot 2, Episode 4. I'm Linda Pepper, and this is a podcast hosted by Nigulak, Einend, and Galkplas. In this episode, I'm joined by two queer voices to reflect on past experiences, present realities, and future hopes for civic participation for queer folks in Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited that you're here. I'd like to start by giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself, and please tell us one thing that has brought you joy recently.
Thank you so much. My name is Elle Khaoma. My pronouns are they, them. I currently work as the comms person in the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. But in my free time, I'm also a digital communications specialist and a content creator. Something that's been giving me joy recently is the inclusion of a lesbian love story in Bridgerton. Franchella stands. I'm so ready. Are you ready?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Florence Nyaoke. My go-to introduction is I am just a human that thinks we can human better. Under that heading, I do programs at the Cosmopolitan Affirming Community. I am a certified event planner, so I do events all around. I do operations for Womanist Institute, the Wawa Aba Womanist Leadership Institute, and I coordinate an outfit and initiative that is looking to reimagine and impact what democracy could look like for Africans and people of African descent globally. Mm-hmm. So I coordinate the Kenya chapter. Within that, on matters human rights, I also involve myself in matters justice, not just gender justice, justice as a broader conversation. And that has taken me to things around prison justice, to things around what happens for people in the discipline service, to things around what happens to widows, children. Let's just say I involve myself in matters that involve humans. Yes.
Thank you so much. I love that you both bring such diverse and nuanced perspectives, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. First, I'd like to give you the opportunity to locate yourself in the conversation we're having today by asking, what are your earliest memories, experiences of engaging with the political process and the civic spaces in Kenya? Florence, you can start.
The political process. I will go with the first one for me was having my parents, and especially my dad, follow the news so diligently and just begin to talk about some of the conversations around the things that were happening. I grew up in a very authoritarian Moi era. And in that time, even for us in school, I remember being just a little girl and having to stand on the road like I'm seeing almost happening now, to sing because the president was passing our town. And those spaces, those times when even our parents could not question anything, it was almost a taboo to mention the president's name if you are not going to add a praise word to it at the end. You know, it was always Mtukufu Rais. That Mtukufu Rais is the one that's like one of my earliest memories of what then that could look like.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Elle before I ask the next question.
Oh my gosh, that's I love that. I feel like you've given me a perspective that I don't often think about. For me, my earliest memories were, of course, watching news. I think all of us watched news with our parents and following up on what's going on politically in the country. But more recently, I'd say, I think politics didn't become a real, quote unquote, thing for me, or rather something that I can see my involvement in up until maybe past 18, once you get to the voting age. And then now, you know, that's when the voting registration or whatever starts. That was around the time. And even then, I can't remember it being a more active, proactive engagement. It was more through the conversations with my peers. So my first involvement with electoral processes wasn't even through voting. It was through talking about, have you gotten your voting card? You know, who are you voting for? Do you even care to vote? And for the longest time, I think I was in spaces where it felt like, because we're queer, it means that we're so outside of the entire political process that it didn't feel like it was unimportant. It felt very important, but it felt hopeless. So that's my first feeling, actually. I think I connect with electoral process as a queer Kenyan is hopeless. Yeah.
You both raise really like valid points, and I can relate so much to feeling outside of the system, and because of that, not really
Yeah,
even
knowing how
knowing
to
how to
engage.
engage with it and
Yeah.
where to start from. And I want that to lead us to a conversation on how are you currently engaging with the political and civic spaces right now.
Lovely. I'd love to start,
Yes,
if you don't
please,
mind.
Elle.
I think genuinely, I just turned 26 a couple months ago. And since turning 25, it's been almost an eye-opening experience for how important it is. As a citizen, of course, you're constantly sold the idea of why it's important to be involved in electoral processes. But specifically as a queer Kenyan, for the most part, I remember making a post about voting and whatnot, and somebody commenting being like, we don't want your votes. Your votes being, LGBTQ community. So I think the way that I'm currently engaging is by finding ways to make voting matter within my community, encourage conversations with people who usually feel very apathetic towards these things, because for the most part, they feel like the laws don't work for them. So what does it matter if you vote, if you don't vote, who you vote for? Currently, I am a registered voter, Niko Kadi.
Yay.
But also, I think I've been more involved in day-to-day conversations. I think there's so much power in the seemingly meaningless conversations that we have with our friends, with our family, with our peers in different spaces, whether that's work, that are often left out of conversations of civic engagement and civic participation. The reason that I feel more engaged in political participation is not because of government-run or IEBC sponsored situations. It's been because of the conversations I've had with my friends, how we all were like, have you gotten your card? This Tuko Kadi for me has been the height of political engagement, because I don't just feel involved myself as a registered voter, as somebody who's been involving myself in civic participation, but also as a part of something larger than me, And that's been a feeling that I think has been lacking for a long time. And I think it's an important feeling when you're asking people to be involved in electoral processes. If I'm involved, then how do I matter in this conversation as well?
Yeah. I agree, because belonging is really important for a group that has felt outside in the margins for so long. Florence, how are you currently engaging?
I lean more on the structure side. With all the things that I do, it's become increasingly important to learn the structures, to learn a bit about the systems, to know what's happening when and why it's happening, and how does that affect the day-to-day within that process. How does that affect me in my work? How does that affect my family? How does that affect other queer people, other citizens? And what does that look like? So now looking at, different processes, the budgeting process, doing a reflection on the different regimes that I've seen from the Moi era, and just noting certain similarities and looking to identify gaps that then would move us closer to an inclusive community within that space.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, because when you better understand the system you're working for, with, against, then the opportunities to influence it become clearer. I love that so much. So I wanted us to have a conversation on some of the challenges and barriers that LGBT plus people face in participating in civic and electoral and political processes. And we've touched on some of that, in like this sense of apathy, this sense of disinterest, and disinterest, lack of knowledge that has come up, where you don't know how to engage with the system, or you don't feel that the system is for you, therefore why engage? Do you think there are any other things that we haven't touched on that are barriers that LGBT plus people face?
I think recently we've seen some progression in terms of intersex legal recognition within the country. Kenya is one of the only countries that recognizes 3 genders, right? Including intersex folks. But for trans people, I think something as, how with the voter registration campaigns that have been going on, the main thing that they keep putting on is the fact that you don't need anything other than your ID. So it's simple. If you only need your ID, why aren't you voting? For trans folks, the problems begin from the ID. I think the lack of legal recognition, but even more than that, the stigma and the kind of violations that trans folks face when they try to engage with anything government, before we even get to electoral processes. If my ID doesn't match the way that maybe I present, or the name that I'm saying to you isn't what on my legal documents, what does that mean for me as a voter? Because then it becomes a case of impersonation. I think that's a barrier that's underrepresented for sure. Because even with queer folks, we spoke about apathy, but beyond that, it's about safety during during voting registration and even during the day of actually casting the vote. When you're physically, for example, as a femme lesbian, I have presentation privilege, in that because I present the way that I do, it means that I can walk into a space, and if I have my rainbow bracelet covered up, I can be stealth if I wanted to. For a lot of queer folks, that's not an option. And so that means you're not just thinking about, okay, I need my ID, I need my this. You also think about how people are going to receive me in the line. The lines are usually so long on the day of voting. Am I going to have an entire group around me? Most of the time, if you're voting in either where you live or whatever it is. That means that you might not be able to do a squad hangout of whatever, which is a form of safety for a lot of queer people. You can't call all of your squad and say we're voting together. So if you're voting in an isolated space and you're just alone and you're a mask presenting lesbian, you already know that when you leave the house and you deal with a matatu person, the interaction is terrible. What does that mean about government processes? I think those are underlooked barriers for queer people.
Yeah.
The judgments of society on presentation, on sexuality, they influence who is actually feeling like this specific process is for me. And when it comes to voting, I think I will always speak for my ITGNC people, because it is so underrated how hard it must be for your presentation. Even with queer people, I think sometimes in the campaigning that we see, it's a matter of, hey, on election day, don't wear your gayest outfit. Maybe hide the rainbow bracelet. But that's an option that's only available to a select few of queer people. What happens to the people whose entire identity presentation is already othered? With or without the rainbow bracelet, you are going to get violated. What does that mean when it comes to safety and security? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Florence. Any additions?
I actually want to ride on the safety and security, but to take it to the other side, for the duty bearers, there's a lot of political scapegoating that then brings this unsafety to our homes. Because whenever they mention something, and in every election we've seen people talk about, or we must remove the gays, or ban the gays, or they're an abomination. So many things have been said, including and not limited to, I think some years back, some two politicians were calling each other gay. I think it was Sakaja and what's his name? Babu Owino, were busy calling each other gay, and it is met as an insult. Never mind that the English word gay means happy. We will not talk about that, but it is called as easy. It is considered an insult. And so consistently within these electoral cycles, we see violence sanctioned by people that should call protection for all citizens. We also see the very underrated and single identity that is given to queer people. We also experience, discrimination along gender, along class, along religion, ethnicity, but all those are minimized at that time. And what matters more is the queerness of people. So then also, even at your home where your ethnicity matches, you're not so sure you can go vote, because this one aspect is very amplified in your life.
Thank you so much for bringing up that point. And we discussed some of it in episode 3, where we're looking at media representation, particularly in the lead up to elections, and how LGBT plus like scapegoating is really prevalent in not just African countries, but Kenya, where politicians will say anything to stir moral panic, as a form of distraction. Instead of discussing governance and policies, they will rally everyone to incite violence against LGBT plus folks. And it raises a really clear issue around safety. And since both of you have discussed safety, I wanted to talk about strategies that LGBT plus people are using to better participate and engage with the civic and electoral processes, given these challenges. Some of your reflections have brought up some points like squad, coming together as a squad to go and register, coming together, deciding we're going to register here and we're going to go together, so that if there is safety in numbers, we can be together when that happens. So what other strategies can you think of that LGBT plus people have used or can use to mitigate some of those challenges? I'll start with you, Elle.
Of course, I can't speak for the larger, because LGBTQ plus, as much as we're othered so much that we feel like we have to be one unified movement, the truth of the matter is everybody does what it feels is good for themselves. I think apart from what I mentioned, like squad bearing, I think people really underestimate the power of numbers when it comes to queer people. A lot of the times when I'm thinking of even a new restaurant to try sometimes, and more or less so because I'm feminine, but like I'll be, are my stud friends going to be safe there? Are my trans friends going to be safe there? And so a lot of the time the safety numbers, in that if it ends up not being a safe space, at least you have numbers to retaliate to whatever it is that you're facing. I think that's a big strategy in terms of voting, because the truth of the matter is I think voting is a very volatile time. Before we even get to the issue of identity, sexual orientation, we already have the tribal anxiety that exists among Kenyans because of historic participation. I think another way that people are facing these challenges is also just educating each other. I always say this, I think in every space that I've been in, as a communication specialist, I believe in the power of gossip and just friendship conversations. I think speaking to each other, when a friend says why they're voting, somebody who you care about, somebody whose lived experience you understand, it's much easier for you to find a way to connect into that as well. Because as a femme lesbian, let me say, if my mask friend is also voting, I'm like, okay, it'll be safer for me at the voting registration place. If they're going to do it, it also makes me feel like, okay, actually I can do it, because I'm not just voting for myself. I'm voting for the community of people that I want to protect, that I want to continue to exist with in this country. Further than that, I'd speak about maybe larger organizations. Something recent, because I work at NGLHRC, something recent that we had was a protest care clinic and civic care clinic, where actually we had IEBC on site to be able to register people. I think this was mentioned in one of the earlier episodes. And that was it seems so small, just being able, okay, IEBC is here, that's cool, IEBC is everywhere. But IEBC is here in a space where they were actually sensitized to people's lived realities before any of the registration started. So as a person who maybe your name doesn't match, or rather, even if your ID details match yourself, your presentation might not match. You have an F marker, but you present as male. Nobody's asking those questions, because the truth of the matter is the most important part is your biometrics stay the same, regardless, right? So it is you voting. Those things are very underrated, but I think creating safe spaces for people who feel like, honestly, I'm not going to risk myself in a more public, more general setting. Creation of safe spaces to vote, to engage in civic conversations, to register as a voter, to even just complain with other queer people about how hard it is to participate in these things, is a really, really underutilized what do you call it?
Strategy?
Yes, strategy. Thank you. A very underutilized strategy for how queer people are surviving. Yeah.
Florence, before I go to you, I want to echo what Elle has said, that our strategies can be large, structured strategies, like the care spaces that break down those initial barriers we've talked about, the navigations we have to do to leave the house to go to the voting center. So the care spaces, those are structured, organized strategies, but it can also be the small ways we engage with each other, talking to each other in general conversation, gossip, to just be like, hey, this is why I think it's important. So I love that. I love that offering, because it's framed it from just the small and simple things we do to the structured, more organized strategies we can use. Florence, please.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. I will look at constitutional engagement. And part of what the movement has done is to look at the Constitution, to provide spaces to unpack what then the Constitution says about safety of citizens of this country. And that also is a conversation that is very important and that continues to get people into a place of safety, knowing that the Constitution is on our side. We, the people, have the power. I'll also look at movement building, because over the years, we've seen movement building evolve and move from the silo organizing that was very fear-ridden into interconnectedness and into just broadening the networks and joining other movements within the region. And that on and of itself continues to now provide safety, because if the women rights is taking care of everybody that says they are female within that space, then it means there is more safety for queer people that are going to vote. I will also look at some of the gains that we have made within the faith space. Having faith leaders that can say, all right, God is on the side of justice, and this is what justice looks like, not oppressing somebody. And so the few that are able to do that and impact spaces within their communities are also continuing to now create spaces that are safe enough for people to engage within their communities, to engage in those civic conversations, because I know the government calls for participation, public participation, that happens every so often, and they happen per region. And within those regions, sometimes just involving queer folk has been difficult. But when such conversations happen within communities, within those chief barazas, and a faith leader is able to stand up and say, wait a minute, we know this child's parents, and we know that this child belongs to this community. And so their ideas, what we are experiencing, they're experiencing too. So can we have the conversation outside of other things around them? And those become some of the ways that our organizing continues to impact and create safety for all of us. And finally, I will speak about the digital space that has allowed us to join global conversations, that has allowed us to look at what is happening across the continent, across the globe, and to begin to unpack some of the violence that colonialism, some of the violence that, white supremacy is bringing into the spaces. And those conversations feed into the broader political perspective and how it is that we are able to engage, because they influence us even without having to move from the safety of our homes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I was going to ask a question around religion, because we know that both religion and politics have been sites of oppression and discrimination for LGBT plus people. But I really appreciate the point you're making around movement building and alliances, fostering alliances and allyship with religious leaders, so that we're not just curating spaces where we feel safe, but we make sure that we're building inroads to the societies and communities we live in to make sure that we're safe on all fronts. I really, really appreciate that. And also in episode 3, we talked about digital media and social media and the opportunities that has given us as LGBT plus people to engage better and more effectively with civic and political processes. So I have a final question, but before that, I want to give you the space and room to share any concluding remark. I will start with you, Florence, then I'll come to you, Elle.
Oh, I feel like there really is no end to this conversation as I get to the concluding remarks. And that participation of queer folk within the civic space has been consistent. It has just been invisibilized. It has been largely informal and underrepresented or under-recognized in the spaces. And so having said that, to talk about each of us has a responsibility as a citizen of this country to participate, because what happens within the political space affects us in our homes, affects the ways that we're able to move, affects our pockets economically, affects a lot of things about our being and our existence. And it's our responsibility to show up. A while back, there was a movement that was talking about, boycotting the voting process. But that is not an option. That ceases to be an option. And when I talk about that, I will look at the 2002 election. I will take us back to that. When people were tired and were saying we need to remove Moi from power and we need somebody new to come into power. And the only thing that worked that time is people mobilized in large numbers and went to vote. The win was sure by the morning. And it's possible for us to do it a second time and any other time that we are called to do the work that liberates all of us in this country.
Thank you so much. We cannot abandon our responsibility as citizens of this country. I love that so much. Elle?
God, I love that. I love when I hear context for times when I don't register as much, because it's really good. Because when I think about like the 2002 election, for me, it's like, okay, I was 3 years old maybe. It's nice to hear that the kind of civic education we're pushing for has existed in times before. What my parting shot or my thing would be is that we're all the same, genuinely. I think something that really irks me is the fact that any single time LGBTQ conversations, people are involved in whatever kind of conversation. Right now, I think we are in one of the largest phenomenons of civic education and engagement that we have ever seen because of the digital space. We see the social media campaigns that are currently ongoing for Tukokadi. And it always irks me when it feels like when we involve queer people, suddenly the conversation feels like it's taking a different trajectory instead of being on the same vision that it initially was. I think Florence said it best. We are all Kenyans at the end of the day. And for queer Kenyans, I would say that despite the apathy, despite the frustration and the just, what does it matter because, the laws that are in place still are against me anyways, small changes, things don't happen overnight. A lot of the countries that we could look at and admire as pinnacles, and they're getting fewer and fewer in the anti-rights anti-rights era. They're getting fewer and fewer. But some of the countries we could look at as pinnacles of like, wow, queer people there are really doing this and doing that and being free to do so. It didn't happen overnight. It happened through all of these consistent, ongoing struggles, these day-to-day conversations, these civic spaces, this NGO engagements, this frustrating fights with, people who are on the anti-rights spectrum. And it's worth it at the end of the day. You might not change it for just yourself. You might change it for people, beyond you. But beyond that, I think for allies, I would say that you are capable of coexisting with queer people. If you're in a voting line and you see somebody whose dressing doesn't make sense to you, that's not your business. You're both there for the same reason. And I think something that we underrate is the fact that we are able to coexist. You do not have to accept somebody's entire identity, entire politics, because the truth of the matter is we are over 7 billion people on this planet. We are not all going to be on the same trajectory of life. It is very, very important to emphasize the ability to coexist. You are able to coexist. You don't have to act on something because of personal belief. I would never see someone who's wearing like black and brown and be like, I don't really fashion, like as a fashion person, I don't accept that, and then violate them. I think that same rhetoric needs to be applied across the board. You are capable of coexisting with a queer person. You have definitely done it before. Everybody always thinks that they don't know a queer person because they assume queer people are all loud and vibrant and you can tell the shoes, the whatever. No, you have definitely, and I do mean definitely. I'm not a researcher. I don't have any studies to back me up. But I promise you have definitely coexisted with a queer person before and you have survived it. So you will do it again. Allow people to vote and do their civic duty. Don't make it a big deal.
Thank you so much. What I have been saying is that the Kenya we want will take all of us. And we need to accept that and work towards that. Really quickly, I'd like to invite any reflections on, does age play a role in how LGBT plus people engage with the civic, electoral, and political processes? I'll start with you, Florence.
I strongly believe that it does. Part of it is the fear that the older generation had within the times that we were growing up. When we talk about that, whatever it is that was said, it was, you made me remember the monies that we're seeing moving in briefcases. Oh, Moi used to move with those. In fact, we'd go line up and sing, as much as my friends and I would sing our own things. Not what we were told. But after that, we would also go and be given milk. And if you were in a boarding school, that's the day there'd be a cow or two, and you would have a separate meal from the normal githeri. So it's not just now that then there is the narrative of the money is coming through. And looking at that and reflecting at that, there's an element of the remembrance of what that time was for people that are older, that then would bring some sort of fear or some sort of, trauma around that period of time. We're also seeing a lot of the older generation looking into how do we impact the systems and how do we move into the systems. While on the other side, you're seeing the younger generation saying, you know what, we've seen, it's wrong, we're moving. Fear is not a factor. We are not going to move in fear. And so it's really interesting. And to note that there is place for both things. There is place for those that would be able to march and charge and go to the front line and be seen, be visible. And there is space for those that will work in the background, in silence, as the older generation have always done and have always, known how to influence those systems from the back so that then the safety at the front can be guaranteed. I think how we engage would definitely differ based
Yeah.
on age.
No, I thank you so much for that. And also for sharing that there is space for both and not even just both, all the perspectives shared here. Yeah. Elle?
I love that answer, but I also think for me, I see it as a double-edged sword. I think on the one hand, I mean, absolutely age does play a factor. I don't think it would be fair of me to say otherwise when it's proven so clearly that that's the case. What I think though, especially speaking as like a Gen Z, I hate that, oh my God, but a Gen Z is on one side, we have this generation of people who for the longest time, for as long as I have been alive, and I do mean as long as I have been alive, I have seen the same people move through the political space. So it didn't feel like something that I can tap into because it seems like one, not only is there an age limit, there's like a specific, you have to be this age and you have to be consistent with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I haven't really seen new faces, despite the fact that we're speaking here as people who've seen different age, eras of Kenyan political participation, and still we can say the same names with the people who are in the spaces, people who are in power. That means that for young people, it doesn't seem like politics felt like a now thing. Like, yes, I'm involved. Yes, I'm voting. Yes, I'm engaging in conversations. But the ages of the people that are actually running these things are so far removed from the age that I am that it feels like politics is a grown-up, quote-unquote, game. But on the other side of that, I think that we've been challenging that. I think Gen Zs are very tired. One, I will attribute that to climate justice. When you're constantly told that your planet is about to die, it's like, okay, it's now or never. We might not be here in a few. But I think also on the flip side of that, especially with the resurgence of digital communications as a form of protest, of civic care, of civic engagement and education, I think that there's also been this thing where a lot of Gen Z people are willing to just try and destabilize different systems. For most of, I don't want to say most, I don't know most Gen Zs, but for a lot of Gen Zs, I think a lot of us are so tired of seeing the same exact people, the same exact systems just work, that it's like, okay, if they're not going to give us a space, we're going to take it. Right? That looks like digital communications, but that also looks like civic engagement. That looks like younger and younger people vying for political office, which I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing in 2027 and even this year as people are campaigning. But I think age does play a factor because even as we are doing all these things, I remember last year during the finance bill protests, there was both this reverence and awe of Gen Zs as people who are frontlining the protests are like, oh my goodness, Gen Zs are doing this. They're really challenging the government. But on the other side of that, there was also this, these are children. Yeah, okay, just let them protest, just leave it alone. And so I think for Gen Zs, it's a delicate balance when you're younger and trying to involve yourself because you want to be taken as serious, but you also don't want to fall into the exact same systems that you're trying to protest. So I absolutely believe that age does play a factor. Something else that I will say, because we had spoken to religion, is that I think more and more we're seeing Gen Zs diverge from more traditional religion spaces. Even people who identify as Christian, as Muslim, are not so much interested in the larger religious systems beyond that, more than their personal faith. That allows for us to have more meaningful conversations on civic engagement, especially when it comes to separation of the church and the state. Yes.
Thank you so much to the both of you for such rich offerings and also for sharing so generously from your experiences and your insights. My final question is a yes or no question. Is a Kenya that ensures inclusive and equitable futures for queer engagement possible?
Wow.
Queer political engagement possible? Yes or no? Elle?
I'm like, should I be the agent of doom and just be like, I don't know, I don't think so. I think because as a climate justice warrior, I'm just like, I hope we'll have enough time to see these changing tides come through before the earth does its thing. But also, I think, yes, it is possible. It might not be in my lifetime, but I think when you think about civic engagement and when you want to be a part of a movement, you have to think beyond yourself. Even if it's not in my lifetime, I do believe it will happen within a certain lifetime. Maybe the next generation, Gen Alpha, we see y'all. But yeah, I think it's possible. I think I don't want to be the agent of doom in that making it seem like it's impossible, because we've seen it happen, even in small spaces. So I think in a larger scale, it'll take a lot of work, but the work has been done and it's continuing. eventually I really do think we will see some fruits.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Florence?
I concur with that. I think it is already emerging in fragments. It's not in whole. Like when we see what the protests have brought about, when we see, and I know this is a very controversial thing, when we see what has happened to the protest favorite, I'm trying to remember his name.
The suits person?
The
Afro.
Tom Boyer.
Caswell?
Afro.
Yes, Caswell. When we see what happened with Caswell and the trajectory that is taking, we already also see that then for us to arrive there is a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of unison that needs to, solidarity that needs to go into this work so that people are no longer conditional citizens the way some people are, so that people are not, invisibilized within our civic engagement, and, a space where faith communities are pro-justice and calling for human dignity as opposed to aligning with political power. One of my friends says, we are seeing an unholy trinity of religion, culture, and politics.
love that.
Yes.
And it is quite unholy. So it would take us dismantling this unholy trinity properly and separating all aspects so that we are able to now achieve a broader, a more inclusive, and a very, very liberated space for all people to exist, for all people to engage, and for all of us to thrive.
Beautiful.
Literally, I wanted to clap, actually.
Yeah. I was resisting the temptation to clap, but I really appreciate all that you have unpacked, both of you, so beautifully, because I think where we're arriving at is that there might be different intergenerational approaches to how we engage with the system. We might have varying early experiences of engagement, even differing current experiences of engagement, from engaging on a more personal level to engaging on a more structural, systemic level, right? But a fair, inclusive, equitable Kenya is possible. It is urgent that we make it possible and that there's examples of how it's already here with us, but we can make it better to make the Kenya we want for all of us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
One last thing. It's just because you mentioned intergenerational, and I thought about the fact that with civic conversations, I think we need more intentional intergenerational conversations, not talking at each other. For the most times, I think across the board, not just LGBTQ people, but generally, we mostly see older people being like, you Gen Zs, you do this. And then Gen Zs being like, you old people, you do this, And I think there needs to be an intentional conversation across the board, different communities, whether that's within tribe, within orientation, whatever it is. I think there needs to be intentional conversation between generations so that we know where we've come from and where we want to go and where we are. Otherwise, we are all just speaking from within our silos of the times that we know and we've existed in. And then we're not working towards a better future, because I think you cannot ignore history unless you're doomed to repeat it.
I'm glad you shared that offering, because the sustainability of our movements, whatever the movements may be, the feminist movement, the gender movements, the sexual rights movement, the climate movement, the sustainability of our movements will require us to remain in dialogue with each other. Solidarity. Yes.
Very much
so. Thank you so much for sharing and for offering. And thank you also for tuning in. Please remember to register to vote, to show up and vote. Querying the ballot, these conversations are one of the strategies we're having to encourage the engagement in civic and political and electoral processes. So do stay tuned for the next episodes. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please remember to subscribe to Inand, Galk Plus, and Nicolak's social media platforms, and stay tuned for next episodes. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.